Hola a todos, buenos días, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Alejandro Insunza. Esta vez estamos con Yvette Montero Salvatico. Yvette es socia de Catch. Catch es una empresa global de Strategic Foresight o prospectiva estratégica que se encarga de innovación y diseño estratégico, y al mismo tiempo ella es cofundadora de The Future School. The Future School es una plataforma a través de la cual ellos han capacitado a muchos líderes en Strategic Foresight a través de los 5 continentes y, como dicen ellos, que a mí me encanta, democratizando el futuro. Thank you very much for being here with us, Yvette. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Subnetics, for this incredible opportunity to speak with a global audience across Latin America. As Alejandro said, my name is Yvette Montero Salvatico, and I'm excited to present some information about strategic foresight over the next few minutes. We'll have a bit of slides and information for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have questions as we go along, please offer them up in the chat, and then we'll have an opportunity to answer them at the end. So with that being said, I'm going to share my slides. Alejandro, can you just confirm that you all can see the slides?
It's perfect.
Excellent, excellent. So today I'm excited to share with you a presentation about how to create the future in a VUCA world. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a VUCA world is, and I'm going to share with you a little secret. You already know how to create the future in a VUCA world. You're doing it every day. So I'll share with you some of the ways you can use strategic foresight to be more purposeful and more aspirational in creating the future today in a very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. As I said, my name is Yvette Montero Salvatico. I am the proud child of Cuban immigrants, first-generation American. I live in Florida, which these days is not the most popular thing to say that you're from Florida, given what's happening in our election. I promise there's some of us that are not crazy. I promise you. I promise you. So my background is in finance and in strategy. I worked for the Walt Disney Company for over 13 years. And that's when I discovered the field of strategic foresight. And I've never been the same since. As Alejandro mentioned, through KEDGE and the Future School, our mission is to democratize foresight. We believe that if more people thought this way, the world would be a better place. We do this through training events, online and in person. We also do custom engagements within organizations. We really believe that every single person has the ability to create a better future. It just needs to be unlocked. And so we do that through our training and experiences. So I'm excited to share some of that with all of you today. First, a question. I would like to know, and you can feel free to share in the chat or just think about it on your own. I want you to think about the constraints that you're facing right now. What is stopping you right now? What are the things that you are dealing with in terms of, we say in the US, fires that you have to put out? What are the urgent matters that you're facing that become constraints, whether it's in your company, in your life, however you want to define it? What are some of those constraints that you're facing? These constraints are often things like money, time. Right now with the pandemic, obviously there's many constraints in terms of being able to travel, feeling safe. But on a typical session before the pandemic, we would hear things like time, resources, perhaps your leadership is a constraint because they're not allowing you to do things that you want to do. Whatever those constraints are, I'm sure that they're very easy to come to mind. Okay, so now imagine, since I used to work at Disney, that I have a magic wand and I'm able to wave that wand and remove all of those constraints. That means you have unlimited money, unlimited time, unlimited resources. You can do everything that you would like. If I could remove all those constraints and you could direct exactly what is done, what would you do? Now, if you're like most people, the question that I asked first was a lot easier to answer. You probably knew right away what those constraints were. But perhaps it was harder to answer the second question. And that is very, very interesting. We are rewarded in our organizations, in our institutions, to get things done. Although we complain about having a long to-do list, we also have an adrenaline rush when we complete the things on that to-do list. But we very rarely stop and ask, where are we going? What are we trying to accomplish? And that's why the future and strategic foresight isn't really about the future at all. It's about the present. Because how we think about the future, whether it's conscious or unconscious, directly impacts the actions we take today. That goes for you, for your leadership, for your teams. And so all too often, we're not consciously thinking about creating the future. We're just trying to get through the day. And while, of course, we have to make decisions today, we need to find a way to make decisions today that have a view towards the future, towards what we want to accomplish. And we're going to do that and show you how to do that through strategic foresight. So first, this idea of VUCA. This idea was coined by the US military many years ago when they landed in Afghanistan. And VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Many of you have probably heard of this phrase, or if not, would agree that it's a very good description for the environment we find ourselves in. Even before the pandemic, we had incredible exponential change, growing uncertainty, more complexity than we've ever seen, and more ambiguity than we know what to do with. So we're in a VUCA environment. We have change coming at us from every domain at a faster pace. Yet we don't know what to do. We're almost paralyzed because it's so uncertain and so volatile. This is where strategic foresight supports our decision making. So let me explain what strategic foresight is and how it can help us. And then I'm going to show you specific ways you can start informing your decision making today with future opportunities. So strategic foresight is a practice. It's been around for many, many years, 100 years. It allows us to create alternative future views and possibilities so that we can become more adaptive, more resilient, and more transformative as leaders, as organizations, as society. We can't predict the future. As you can see here, I have the lottery numbers in this visual. We can't predict the future. If we could predict the future, I would already know who the president is in the United States, which I do not know. I hope it will be who I want it to be, but I don't know. So we can't predict the future, but we need to map the future. And we create those maps using strategic foresight that allows us to look at the trends in the environment, pull from those trends, and make really good maps about the future that allow us to be more resilient, adaptive, and transformative. Those maps allow us to test our strategy, develop better innovations, and really create transformational change, again, within ourselves, within our organizations, and across society. The framework that we use at KEDGE and the Future School is called the Natural Foresight Framework. It's called that because it uses natural growth curves, which work better in a complex environment. These aren't steps, but more like facets, areas that we can focus on with tools that can support us in creating a more equitable future for all. I'm going to take you through each one of these and talk about what you can begin doing today to start using the future in your favor. Let's start with discover. With discover, we're talking about setting context and background. But more importantly, discover is about discovering our blind spots, our unconscious assumptions as individuals or as organizations. And we do that through a number of tools. I want you to think about discover as this idea of looking through a door, but looking only through the keyhole. So if you can imagine that I'm looking into this meeting, only looking through the keyhole of the door, you can imagine that I have a very limited perspective if I'm trying to look inside a room, but only through the keyhole. It's very limiting in my perspective. Trying to create change from the landscape of today is very much like trying to figure out what's happening inside of a room, but only looking through the keyhole. Foresight allows us to open the door and go in the room, travel to the future, to be unlocked from our biases and our assumptions. When we look at the future or at change or innovation from the standpoint of today, all we can think about is what we have to lose. All we can think about is the power that we can lose, the struggles, the consumers that we have today, the employees we have today. We're not able to see what's possible. So through strategic foresight, we jump into the future and are able to make better choices and better decisions. There's lots of examples of organizations that continue to look through the keyhole instead of traveling to the future. Probably the most famous example is Kodak. And I found this publication, and it was from sometime in the year like 2000 something. So it's not that old. I mean, I guess it's now 20 years old, maybe 15 years old, but it's not super old. And I thought it was so interesting. This is a publication that Kodak issued. And I'm just going to read some of it to you. It says, in an uncertain world, nobody wants to trust their priceless images and information to the kind of uncertainty of like an online repository. That's why they turn to Kodak. So basically what they're saying here is that it's not safe to store your photos digitally. That the only way to be sure that you can save a photo is to have it printed. Now, of course, we know that that's not necessarily the case. If you have an image digitally, you can back it up. You can have several sources of it, several copies of it. And if you have an image only physically produced, it could get wet. It could get, burnt. But they were so certain in their belief that physical photos were the best that they literally published this publication that said, you're going to get a file format error. You can't find that file again. Don't trust digital for your memories. And this is in the mid-2000s. They were still pushing this narrative. And so when this happens, we call it educated incapacity. Educated incapacity is knowing so much about what you know, your expertise, that you're the last to know that things are changing. And guess what? It's not just Kodak that has educated incapacity. I have it. Alejandro has it. We all have it. The more experience we have, the more tenure we have, the more likely we are to have educated incapacity. So what are we to do? If we're not careful, we'll be like Kodak. We'll miss the future. So foresight allows us to strategically let go of old information so we can let new information in. We talk about that as learning, unlearning, and relearning. And Alvin Toffler said that the illiterate of the 21st century won't be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn, which is true. There's all types of literacy in the 21st century. Digital literacy, futures literacy is also an important skill and mindset. So for Discover, what I want you to do is if you think an idea sounds ridiculous, I want you to stop and ask why. Why do I think that that sounds ridiculous? And better yet, surround yourself with diverse perspectives that challenge you so that you don't miss the future because of your educated incapacity. Excellent. Let's move to explore. In the explore phase, we're talking about trends, but not just trends. We're talking about environmental scanning to find trends, values, and implications. We call this the lifeblood of strategic foresight. Why is that? The reason why we have educated incapacity is that we really filter most of the information we receive unconsciously. That means that we're relying on our existing mental models to interpret information for us. That's dangerous in a VUCA environment when things are changing so quickly. So if we scan broadly, which means I'm going to scan social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends, then I'm more likely to be able to overcome the unconscious filtering of the information. In strategic foresight, we talk about the 3 environments of foresight. The center is the organization. The second circle is the industry. The third is the external environment. Your future disruptors, competitors, and opportunities are more likely to come from outside your industry than within it. Again, your future opportunities and disruptors are much more likely to come from outside your industry than from within it. So we need to scan that broad macro environment across steep social, technological, economic, environmental, and political to be able to ensure that we don't miss the future. When we conduct good scanning, it rewires our brains, and you're able to identify the signal in all the noise. And this is a critical part of using strategic foresight to create the future in a VUCA environment. So for explore, I want you to scan broadly. I want you to identify trends and values and implications across STEEP. STEEP, again, stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political domains. I want you to read across all of those publications. And again, if you think something sounds ridiculous, ask yourself why, surround yourself with diverse perspectives, and you'll be able to overcome the tendency to interpret new information based on your old beliefs. Let's move on to mapping. Mapping is about world building. This is where we get past the keyhole of the future and build that future world. It's often expressed as scenarios, although that is not the only mapping tool in foresight. Basically, mapping is about knowing that we can't predict the future, but we can create maps of multiple possible futures so that we can be prepared for any future that comes to pass. A good visual for showcasing mapping is the cone of possibilities. Here you see that it's illustrated by a flashlight, which demonstrates that close in terms of time, closer into the source of the light is very dense. But as time passes, the light expands, and so does the number of possible futures. So we have to map across this cone of possibilities so that we're better prepared for whatever future emerges. We talk about being adaptive, resilient, and transformative in foresight. And these are those multiple futures. The official future is what we traditionally use in our forecasts. And that's great. We need to be prepared for resilience and an official future. But in a VUCA environment, that's less likely to be the only future that emerges. We also have to be prepared for adaptation to avoid breakdown. And more importantly, we have to see those potential breakthroughs and be ready to transform. We have to see those disruptions before they disrupt us so that we can be the disruptors. That's what transformation is about. So mapping futures across the cone of possibilities allows us to be adaptive, resilient, and transformative. I love this quote about scenarios because ultimately foresight is about change. It's about helping people understand what's coming so they can be better prepared and take appropriate action in the present. Scenarios allow us to create narratives so that individuals are more likely to adapt change. Scenarios aren't just about data. They reach the heart and the minds of the people that we're trying to serve. So for mapping, I want you to try to think in simultaneous multiples. When I say simultaneous multiples, that means that we think about multiple futures happening all at once. And for every decision, I want you to think about multiple possible outcomes. And that'll help you be more adaptive, resilient, and transformative, as opposed to being brittle and fragile with only one official future. Okay, last but not least, let's create the future. This is where we begin to implement all of our foresight learning. We make better strategy, we develop transformative innovation, and we create long-lasting change. Think about foresight as an immune system for ourselves and for our organizations. Through the tools of strategic foresight, we can test possible outcomes in a safe place so that whatever future emerges, we're ready. Shell Oil is a great example of this back in the 1970s. They credit strategic foresight with helping not just weather the storm of the oil embargo crisis, but actually propel themselves to the top of the industry. Because when things started to go wrong or different, they weren't paralyzed. So we need to rehearse possible futures as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. So we're not caught paralyzed when things begin to change. In this way, I want you to think about strategic foresight as your new, updated operating system. Strategic foresight and its methodologies should run in the background of everything that we do, fueling our culture, our leadership development, our strategies, our innovation, and our efforts for transformational change. This is not something that we just do once a year or once every 5 years. We should be using foresight in every decision we make every single day. Ultimately, the future exists across a spectrum, and we're too focused on one side, which is the push of the future. On the push side of the future are those trends, emerging issues, the coronavirus, that are pushing us to the future whether we like it or not. On the pull end of the future is our aspirations, the things that we want to achieve. In fact, the name of our firm, Kedge, comes from the idea of the pull of the future. A kedge is an anchor, a smaller anchor on a sailing vessel. And when there was no wind at sea, they would deploy the kedge and they would send it out in a rowboat far in the direction they wanted to head. Once that kedge was dropped, those people remaining on the boat would pull themselves to that destination. So essentially, pulling or kedging ourselves to the future is identifying our aspirations. So think back to those first two questions I asked you at the beginning of this presentation. The push is those obstacles that you're facing, those constraints, those trends. The pull is what you would do if all constraints were removed. Both ends of the spectrum are critically important. We have to understand what's happening on the push side so that we can migrate or navigate to the pull or our aspirations. But most importantly, what I have found after years of doing this work is that good foresight produces an interesting effect. When you are conducting foresight as your operating system, you will find that you're not just pulling yourself to your aspirational future. You can actually pull that future to today. And that's essentially how you do it. We're all creating the future every day with the decisions we make. With strategic foresight, we can create that future in a more purposeful, aspirational, and collaborative way. And that's what foresight allows us to do. And that's how you create the future in a VUCA environment. I want you to think not just about the obstacles, but more importantly, what you would do if all the obstacles were removed. And make sure that you're running your organizations and yourselves with foresight. Fueling yourself with foresight is the way to create more equitable and transformational futures every day. So as you think about the questions that you want to ask, and I think there might be some already coming through, I wanted to offer you this small gift. It is a short overview of strategic foresight. It covers a bit more about the different aspects that we talked about today. And if you just email me at info@thefutureschool.com, there's 2 S's right next to each other there, we will gladly send that publication to you. So I'll leave this up and ask Alejandro what questions everyone has.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Unfortunately, we don't have so much time, but I would like to make a couple of questions. The first question is, how do you connect this vision of future with the day-to-day execution of a company?
Yes. So ultimately, we want to make sure that we're thinking transformationally, but acting incrementally. So with the idea of our aspiration in mind, then we put forth the day-to-day decisions that are going to make that aspiration a reality. Foresight has a number of tools to allow us to test our current strategy and decision-making, as well as create new strategies that are going to be effective in multiple operating environments.
Thank you. Another question. In relation to the mapping step, is any probability of success associated with these multiple possible futures raised? In the case of yes, what methodology is used for that?
So can you ask it one more time?
Related to the mapping stage, is any probability of success associated with these multiple possible futures raised?
So you don't necessarily assign a probability to any future. There's different ways to create scenarios. A very popular way is using scenario archetypes, where we would create 3 or 4 scenarios for a particular focal issue. One scenario would be a positive operating environment, one would be a negative operating environment, and one would look more like an extrapolation of today. We don't assign probabilities and we don't choose a scenario. Rather, we imagine that any of them could play out and we pull ideas from all of them to create more resilient, adaptive, and transformative strategy today. And that's how we ensure that we're covering the cone of possibilities, because any of those futures, and actually all elements of those futures, will come to pass. There's also ways with tools that we have to monitor the environment to see which future might be coming to pass or which elements might be coming to pass. Those signposts are then put into our environmental scanning efforts, so we have a radar to continue to monitor.
Good. And the last question, this is my question. You talk about the educated incapacity. How do you deal with the infoxication we have nowadays? Because we have a lot of information from the media, and how do you distinguish what is true, what is false? How do you do with that?
Yes, it's very difficult because we don't realize how much information we actually process unconsciously. Google estimates that we unconsciously process 99.999996% of the information. So that means we're relying on our mental models that were framed and created many years ago. So one of the main things that we have to do is surround ourselves with people that think differently than ourselves, to always question our own thinking, and to realize that we have to move more of our information filtering from unconscious to conscious. If we're aware of how we're processing information, if we're active in that process, if we surround ourselves with diverse perspectives, and if we look to diverse sources of information, we're more likely to be able to discern fact from fiction.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we don't have more time, but thank you so much for your presentation. It was awesome. Muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos en la próxima.
Thank you, everybody.